Welcome to Balcony Babble. Like I said in the last Off the Ledge, we're not on a balcony. Oh well. Tough break. But today we have a very interesting topic with special guest, my brother-in-law John. Today we're going to talk about his experience as a teacher. Obviously, hot topic, having to teach online. Obviously, that's just not conducive to anything. So, and then we're going to go into something a little more interesting to the both of us, a little more fun at least, I'd like to say, which is John's ability to incorporate D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, obviously, into his teaching. And so we'll get there later, but first, let's get right down to it, because I feel like most stories I've had to do lately have obviously been about the pandemic. So let's start with, what was it like having to teach online? What were some of the struggles you had to face?
I mean, the short version, it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it was like the Wild West. The fact that I remember that my school originally had the plan, like most of the other things, it's only going to be 2 weeks. So we had the kids kept home normally on Fridays so that they have a half day. We figured just keep them home because they only come in for like 2.5 hours anyway. We would prep for the entire day, have like binders or packets. We would send the stuff home with the kids. We would teach from home, but it would mostly be like facilitating the work that we had given them. Lo and behold, the world turns even more sideways after a 2-week period, and then we had to then figure out how we're trying to keep some semblance of routine and then a curriculum from home, all while trying to juggle the fact that these are not neurotypical kids, meaning they run the gamut of emotional, intellectual, and learning disabilities, and being able to translate that from an in-person setting to over a screen. So, long story short, it sucked.
Now, had you met these kids in person like before, or was this like a fresh class for you?
See, that's the funny thing, like about the way that my school worked, is that that was my first year teaching. So I had from August up until it was about February to March to get to know them, and we knew each other very well. I knew the kids well, they knew me well, that we knew each other's idiosyncrasies, so that routine wasn't really that hard to keep. But given the nature of my school, it's more of a transitional facility where kids through an outreach need to come to us because of whatever reason their private or public school can't meet their educational or behavioral needs. Mm-hmm. So I remember that it was like May or so, and I had a student that joined remotely for the better part of only a month. So the first time I actually fully met him was just this past school year.
Oh, wow. What was it like having to set up, meetings with parents online?
Ironically, as tough as it was to teach and sometimes even have the students logging on for class, so to speak, because that was their school for the better part of 4 to 5 months. Parents were ironically a little bit easier to get a hold of because given the nature of a lot of their professions, they were used to sitting at either on screens or on phones for a decent period of time. Mm-hmm. So it made parent-teacher conferences a breeze. The fact that they were limited to only 15-minute blocks. So I have some parents that will talk your ear off for the better part of an hour, which is fine. Like, especially some of these parents are very good-natured and sweet. But the fact that they knew they only had 15-minute blocks of time, it meant that we had to be very succinct and only get to the key parts of their child's progress versus they'll say one thing, go off on maybe 3 tangents of a story, and then maybe cycle back. So it made things a little bit more regimented, which, at least in that instance, in terms of housekeeping, was nice.
I did feel that, as awful as things were, there were some things that became a little easier at times. A little bit. Things like you just said, having that short block of being able to get right to the point. Mm-hmm. It has its benefits, but at the end of the day, not really. So let's get into some of the more fun stuff. Now, you incorporate D&D into your curriculum. For anyone that's not a nerd like the rest of us, that is Dungeons and Dragons, a tabletop role-playing game. So what made you think to incorporate that?
Well, I don't exactly hide the love that I have for various nerdy culture from my students, like especially since my dress code at the school is very lax. So a lot of the times I'll wear graphic tees that have either comics or nerd related fandoms on them, so they at least got minorly intrigued in it. And the fact that I teach middle school boys too, the fact that they either hate everything or they're ambivalent to everything. So the fact that I would mention this offhanded to them, I could see that they were mildly intrigued. So, given the nature of the school too, that they would have lunch clubs, so I initially pitched it to them. If you guys want to play this and we see how it goes, we'll go from there. And I ended up finding out that they were head over heels for it. So I decided to incorporate a little bit into my curriculum in the sense of that if they followed class expectations and routines, then they would get experience points, which then they could obviously translate to in game. So it was a more extrinsic reward, meaning that they earned a tangible something.
Right.
Compare that to, say, like, the reward of if you work on your assignment for like 20 minutes, you get, say, like a sticker on a sticker chart or like a piece of candy kind of thing. But the experience points for D&D was odd in the sense it was an extrinsic reward, but it was intrinsic, meaning that it was a self-motivator because it wasn't anything physical, but they knew that they would do better in game. And I saw that once I had a list of expectations and then incorporating that to the amount of experience points they can get per day, which would then become a weekly total, it helped turn around some behaviors that normally were a little bit rockier before.
Well, that's great. Now, obviously, as players and all, there's so much to the game, right? Have your kids picked up on anything in D&D, such as, I don't know, anything educational? Like, for example, there's a whole economy system to this game. Like, what do you think they've picked up on from the game, if anything?
Well, for those who haven't played, the fact that as much as Dungeons & Dragons is a game where it's literally losing yourself in some type of fantasy setting, whether it's from a more Tolkien high fantasy style setting or a more magic or steampunk style world, it all comes down to rolling dice, which involves math. So the fact that my students, who are ranging from, like any other student, ranging from pretty weak to pretty strong math students, the fact that they would have to roll their dice, do some quick addition or multiplication on the fly, they got used to practicing some quick facts. They also had to learn how to quote unquote balance a budget with buying cool magic items versus the amount of gold that they have, pooling their resources together. And that was the thing that really they took the biggest thing away from it. The fact that these kids are, as I mentioned before, not neurotypical, meaning that they have various learning disabilities. And one of the biggest for them is having, or the lack thereof, of social pragmatics, learning how to interact with one another and learning how to problem solve. So the fact that they'll regularly put their heads together and figure out how to defeat this dragon or how to infiltrate a bandit hideout or even simply trying to steal an item from a shop without getting noticed. The fact that there are these kids that for a while there was one that was very abrasive, and I wouldn't necessarily consider him the bully, but he was one that kind of was pretty rude to other kids. And then you have ones that are much more meek, and I probably hadn't heard what their voice sounded like for months. And yet they're regularly interacting and bouncing ideas off of each other. So the fact that they're taking skills that normally they wouldn't have practiced before and are utilizing in game, that's the biggest takeaway for them.
Well, I mean, I will say, for the people that don't play Dungeons and Dragons, it really does, I think, way more during Dungeons and Dragons sometimes than I think when I'm in school. Like you said, the whole, the currency, I think I balance my budget better in the game than I do in real life, if I'm being honest. But what campaign did you throw them in?
So that's the fascinating thing. Whereas I've run campaigns with my home group, which Curse of Strahd, which is like a Dracula style campaign. One that currently that you're part of now is Eberron, the campaign that's much more Steam and Magic Punk. Whereas my home games are with older players, meaning young adults, if not adults, and they have the capability of being able to have social interactions, being able to move the plot forward with their words and their character interactions. Middle school boys, they just want to have a big monster that they can fight. So it really doesn't matter what I throw them in. The fact that if I just give them enough of a story beat to move from point A to point B and say, fight these goblins here, you move up the mountain, you fight some owlbears here, move up the mountain, you fight a white dragon.
Right.
So they really don't care what kind of story or campaign that they're in, so long as they have the chance to really do cool things and fight big monsters.
Do you make them roleplay a fair amount?
I know what they're capable of, being that these are my students now that I've known for the better part of like 2 years. So I know that they have it in them a little bit. There were instances I remember, especially last year before the pandemic hit, that I would be the NPC shopkeep that they would try and bargain with, and it was funny seeing them try and play out the idea of trying to steal something from him, only for him to unceremoniously just whisk them out of the shop, because there's always the story beat that you play that every shopkeep is a retired level 20 adventurer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of the, I just know what they're capable of, and if I feel like it gives them a chance to practice those social skills that they really are working on, then I'll try and encourage it. But then at the end of the day, I know that these are anywhere from like 12 to 14-year-old boys, and they, again, would rather hit things with a stick than they would talk to each other.
So I take it a fair amount of them stick to martial classes.
Surprisingly, the first time I played this with my students, there's a surprising amount of magic that was thrown around, because when I pitched it to them, that of the various classes that they can play, that there were some that were interested in being the frontline fighters, barbarians, paladins. But then I had a surprising amount of sorcerers and wizards in the party, because once I pitched to them that they can use the famous spell that everyone knows of D&D, even if you haven't played it, Fireball, just point at something, make it explode, that's the route that they took. Because, like, quite frank, to a 14-year-old, it's more impressive to make things explode from a distance than it is to hit something with an axe.
Little did they know the math that would come with being a wizard.
So they found out, unfortunately, after that. All the dice that you had to roll and all the ones you had to re-roll, whereas on this go-around, I have a student that played a barbarian, and he had the time of his life, because he just got to be the frontline guy and just hit things with big sticks, as he said.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to see, such a creative outlet that could really, you wouldn't think, I guess you would think, but not the average person would think, could really help kids kind of express themselves in a positive way. And then it's another way to kind of sneak in some math. Obviously, you mentioned the social interactions that can come with it. And I really think that's the basis I wanted to cover with this podcast. It was really such an interesting time. I remember I'd come out into the living room and you just want to pull your hair out trying to teach those kids.
It was not pretty. It really wasn't.
How long did you have to teach during the day?
The thing was that, unlike other districts that would have either a modified schedule, or they almost ran it like a college course, that they would say, here's your assignments, make sure they're done by the end of the school day, quote unquote, which it could be anywhere from 2:30 to 3. We kept our normal schedule, meaning that the kids logged on for their first period by 8, and we weren't done up until 3. So there were times when I had to look, and they ran for full classes too, so I had to look at my screen for the better part of 40 minutes for months. 40-minute periods for 8 periods, Monday to Friday, and my eyes would be tired by the end of the day, and my back would be killing me. I constantly would have to sit up and crack my shoulders, make sure that I wasn't falling asleep or that I was not sitting stiffly. It wasn't fun.
I'm sure. Now, what topics did you cover? Like, what was your...
Given the nature of our school, that we kind of have to do a little bit of everything. Since I focused on last year, I should say, or what was it, the 2019 and the 2020 school year, I taught 5th and 6th grade, which was still considered quote unquote like elementary school, so I had to teach just about everything. So your typical ELA, math, science, social studies. Whereas this past go around, it was strictly just ELA and science. But even if it was just the 2 subjects, like if I was just strictly remote like it was this year, it would have been awful, especially since I found that it was much easier to teach math and ELA remotely, because especially if you were just reading a book and discussing, that's the nature of it, is easy to do. Especially you can pull up, like I did, you can pull up digital versions of the book, share your screen, and read it that way. Math, the same way. I I could have written out equations, put my camera on it, and then show them how it's done. Science and social studies are so hands-on, especially that it was nearly impossible to do it, because how am I supposed to do an experiment with my students when I don't know if they have the materials at home? They can't participate by physically mixing components together. I would have to do it all on my own. So it was more of whatever I did. I was the one perpetuating it, but they were just almost like a passive viewer.
Did you have to deal with cameras being shut off like us awful college students do?
See, the thing is that college students at least have the understanding of what the expectation for a remote class is, and you guys have the wherewithal to know that if you don't do that, that you understand the natural consequences of your actions. Whereas if, like, let's put it this way, the professors also know that if a college student has their camera off, that more often than not, they give them the benefit of the doubt that they're still there and sitting and listening, because people naturally just don't like knowing that they're being stared at for a long time. But with my students, they were savvy enough that once they have it off, that they would have other tabs open, so that they, say if they're being checked on by their parents, they could quickly switch over to make it look like they're participating, but we knew full well that they weren't. Especially when the very beginning of the pandemic, when Google didn't have any of the bells and whistles that they have now, whereas in terms of only the host can screen share, only the host can put in the chat if they so choose. Whereas I had students muting each other. I had students spamming the chat with memes and profanity. I had ones logging off on a whim. I had ones not even logging on to begin with. So compare that to a college student who has the understanding of their consequences versus kids who don't. It was, as I said earlier, the Wild West.
Right, of course. And I really think that now that's all that I really wanted to cover. But again, I really just wanted to cover sort of the difficulties that you had to go through and bring a little fun to it with the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. Because lately, all the topics have been about, the pandemic, and it's gloomy. So, hopefully bring a little bit of fun to it with Dungeons and Dragons. And I think we're going to switch over to Off the Ledge, which is just going to be me and John shooting the shit about Dungeons and Dragons, some of our experiences, and that's about it. We'll catch you there. Stay tuned.